Close your eyes and picture yourself stepping back in time. The year is somewhere around the 1300s. The world looks familiar in some ways, but in others it feels completely alien. Stone buildings rise in crooked lines along muddy streets. The smell in the air is sharp and heavy, carrying smoke from wood fires mixed with something far less pleasant. Horses clatter by, their hooves sinking into the wet ground, while chickens scatter underfoot. The rhythm of daily life is slower than ours, but it is also harsher. Think about your own day. Maybe you woke up in a warm bed, had a quick shower, poured yourself a drink from the fridge, or scrolled through your phone before breakfast. Every single one of those things would have been unimaginable to someone in medieval Europe. Comfort, safety, and convenience were not words that described life then. The truth is simple. You would not last 24 hours in medieval times. Not because you are weak, but because the world was built differently. Food, water, work, sickness, even the way people went to the bathroom, everything was a struggle. For the people who lived then, it was normal. For us, it would be unbearable. In this journey, we will walk through their world gently, step by step. We will look at the food they ate, the homes they lived in, the diseases that hunted them, and the endless labor that filled their days. We will meet people who shaped that world, from peasants to kings. We will uncover mysteries and strange customs, and finally compare the lives of the poor with the luxury of the rich. The goal is not to frighten you, but to understand. To let you imagine what life was like, in all its rough textures and slow rhythms. So settle in, pull up your blanket, and get comfortable. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a journey into the past. Leave a comment to let me know what you think, and tell us where in the world you are tuning in from. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let the past unfold around you. Think your life is hard? You would not last a single day eating the meals of a medieval peasant. Modern comforts have made us soft, and what people back then dealt with every day at the dinner table would shock you to your core. Forget everything you have seen in movies about grand feasts with giant turkey legs, tables overflowing with roasted meat, and goblets of sweet wine. Those were not for the common folk. Those scenes belonged to kings, nobles, and perhaps a handful of wealthy merchants. For everyone else, meals were bland, repetitive, and often dangerous. The heart of medieval cooking for ordinary people was a dish called pottage. Pottage was not exactly soup and not exactly stew. Imagine a watery broth simmering in a blackened iron pot that never left the hearth. Into it went whatever the household could spare, mostly vegetables like onions, leeks, and cabbage, maybe a few beans or peas. The pot might bubble for days, with leftovers simply reheated and new ingredients tossed in. You can picture it, steam rising from the same dark vessel, day after day, its flavor slowly muddling together. If you were lucky, there might be a scrap of meat or a bone dropped in, though this was rare for peasants. More often it was just plants, boiled until soft. The taste was plain, the texture was mushy, and the smell was earthy, not unpleasant but never exciting. Some writers of the time even compared it to animal feed, since animals and humans were often eating the same grains. Bread was the second pillar of the medieval diet, but it was not the fluffy sliced bread you know today. Instead, it was dense and dark, baked from rye or barley rather than soft white wheat. Often it was heavy to chew, and left you feeling full but not satisfied. And hidden inside that bread were dangers you could not see. The flour was ground between stone wheels, and small chips of grit often fell into the mix. Each bite of bread could grind down your teeth, wearing them out early in life. Archaeologists have studied medieval skeletons and found jawbones with teeth worn almost flat. Imagine chewing your sandwich and feeling stone dust in every bite. Worse still was something invisible, ergot, a fungus that grew on rye. When people ate bread infected with ergot, they suffered burning sensations, strange hallucinations, and even convulsions. Entire villages might be struck, people trembling and seeing visions they could not explain. Some historians believe this madness fed the fires of witch hunts, as neighbors accused one another of dark magic, when in reality the problem was hidden in their bread. Meat was a luxury, and even when available, it was rarely fresh. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. To hide the taste, cooks covered it with spices if they could afford them. The wealthy sprinkled cinnamon, cloves, or pepper, brought from faraway lands, but peasants had no such luck. They simply had to swallow the sour flavor, holding their nose if needed. The idea of a 5-second rule would have been laughable in medieval times. Food that today would go straight to the trash often ended up in the pot. Waste not, want not, was more than a saying, it was survival. And what about something to drink? You might reach for a clean glass of water, but in medieval Europe that would be dangerous. Most water was polluted, flowing through streams and wells contaminated with human waste or animal runoff. Drinking it could bring sickness or even death. So instead, everyone, including children, drank ale. Not the strong beer we think of today, but a weaker version that was safe because the brewing process killed germs. Still, it was alcoholic, and studies of medieval diets show that an average peasant might consume as much as 8 pints per day. Even children as young as 5 would drink ale with meals. Imagine going to school with a jug of beer in your lunchbox. Fish was also common, especially on days when the church banned meat. But unless you lived near the coast or a river, fish was usually salted or dried, preserved for long journeys. The smell was sharp, the flesh tough and leathery. It filled the stomach but offered little pleasure. Picture yourself now, sitting at a rough wooden table in a smoky hut, a bowl of thin pottage in front of you, a hunk of hard bread on the side, and a mug of warm ale to wash it down. Around you, the room is dim, lit only by firelight. The taste is dull, the texture's gritty, and every swallow reminds you that your stomach has no other choice. This was the rhythm of eating in medieval times, not a feast, but survival. And after filling yourself with ale and bread, there was another reality to face. Where do you go when nature calls? That question leads us gently into the next challenge of medieval life: the bathroom. After eating your bowl of pottage, chewing on gritty bread, and washing it all down with ale, sooner or later nature would call. In the modern world, we barely think about it. You walk into a clean bathroom, close the door, and press a shiny handle when you are done. In medieval times, there was nothing so simple or so private. For most people, the bathroom was a chamber pot. Imagine a wide bowl or bucket, usually kept under the bed. When you needed it, you pulled it out, used it, and then had to decide what to do with the contents. Some emptied it themselves, while others waited for collectors to come around. But either way, it had to go somewhere. The most common destination was out the window. In crowded towns, people tipped chamber pots into the streets below. Imagine walking home at night, only to hear a cry from above. In some places, people shouted "Gardez-vous," a warning borrowed from French that meant, "watch out for the water." But the water was not water at all. Rules were sometimes made to keep things cleaner. For example, in parts of London, waste was only allowed to be dumped after 10 at night. But rules are hard to enforce when every household is balancing convenience against discomfort. The streets quickly filled with filth, mixing with mud, straw, and rainwater to make a thick and unpleasant sludge. If you happened to visit a castle, the arrangements were different, though not much better. Castles often had garderobes, small stone rooms with a hole cut into a bench. Waste fell down a chute, sometimes straight into the moat. At Dover Castle, archaeologists found a garderobe shaft that dropped nearly 70 feet. Picture sitting there in the cold, on a stone seat with a draft rising up, while the wind howled outside. Kings and queens may have sat on thrones, but their toilets were not much more than holes in the wall. For people out in the countryside, the solution was often even simpler. Fields, hedges, or communal pits were used. In some villages, cesspits were dug and lined with wood or clay. Over time, these filled up, and the unpleasant job of cleaning them out fell to workers called gong farmers. A gong farmer's job was dangerous and difficult. They worked only at night, lowering themselves into cesspits, scooping waste into buckets, and hauling it away. The stench clung to them so strongly that they were not allowed to join public gatherings or churches. Yet the pay was surprisingly high, sometimes 4 times the wage of an ordinary laborer. It was dirty work, but it was work. Even with these efforts, the smell of medieval towns was legendary. Visitors wrote of streets that reeked so strongly they could hardly breathe. The River Thames in London was sometimes called a monster of stink, choked with waste pouring in from countless homes and privies. Imagine walking past it on a warm summer day, the air heavy and sour, with no escape from the smell. Toilet paper as we know it did not exist. Instead, people used what they had: leaves, moss, scraps of cloth, even their own left hand. Wealthier people might have small bundles of wool, hemp, or linen scraps, but these were luxuries. In most cases, it was whatever was available. Long before, the Romans had used sponges on sticks, rinsed in vinegar or salt water, but that knowledge was mostly forgotten. By the medieval period, hygiene was not a priority. Washing hands was rare, and bathing itself was uncommon, often reserved for special occasions. For many, the idea of daily cleanliness simply did not exist. Now pause and imagine it. You have eaten your bread and pottage, drunk your ale, and now you are making your way down a narrow, muddy street at night. The air is cold, but the smell is strong. A bucket tips out from a window above, splashing into the gutter. You pull your cloak tighter and try not to breathe deeply. This was the everyday reality for millions of people, not just for a day, but for their entire lives. And yet people carried on. They grew used to the smell, the dirt, and the lack of privacy. To them, it was normal. To us, it would be unbearable. From food to bathrooms, survival in medieval times was always about making do with what you had. But food and waste were only the beginning. The rhythm of medieval life was also shaped by the endless work that filled every day, from sunrise to sunset. That is where we will go next, into the daily grind of medieval labor. Endless work from dawn to dusk. After filling your stomach with pottage and bread, and finding somewhere, anywhere, to relieve yourself, the rhythm of the medieval day continued. For most people, that rhythm was work. Hard work, endless work, the kind that shaped every moment from sunrise to sunset. Picture yourself waking in a small wooden hut, the walls rough and cold, the roof dripping with damp after a night of rain. You pull yourself out of a straw mattress that itches and pokes, covered with a wool blanket that never quite keeps out the chill. There is no clock, but you know the time by the light. The rooster crows, the church bell tolls, and the village slowly stirs awake. For peasants, who made up the majority of the population, every day was filled with labor. Most were tied to the land, either as serfs who owed service to their lord, or as free peasants who still had to work the fields to survive. The work changed with the seasons, but it never truly stopped. In spring, the fields had to be plowed and sown. Heavy wooden plows, drawn by oxen or horses if you were lucky, cut into the earth. The soil was tough, the tools simple, and the labor exhausting. You can almost hear the creak of the wooden frame, the grunt of the animals, and the calloused hands guiding the blade. Seed was scattered by hand, carefully, since every grain mattered. Summer brought weeding, tending crops, and cutting hay. The sun was hot, but the work did not pause. Sweat ran into the eyes, backs bent low, and fields seemed endless. Harvest in autumn was even harder. Sickles sliced through stalks of wheat, bundles were gathered, and carts groaned under the weight. The harvest had to be done quickly, before weather spoiled it, so entire families worked together, even children. Winter brought its own tasks: mending tools, feeding animals, repairing roofs, spinning wool, weaving cloth. There was less to harvest, but never truly rest. Life was a constant cycle of effort, tied to the turning of the seasons. If you were a craftsman, your day looked different, but no less demanding. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron in smoky forges. Bakers rose before dawn to knead dough and tend ovens. Carpenters shaped wood into tools, wagons, or furniture, their hands stained with splinters and resin. Each trade had its rhythm, and most were learned from childhood, passed down from parent to child. Even simple household tasks took immense time. Fetching water meant walking to a well or stream, filling buckets, and carrying them back. Washing clothes meant scrubbing in cold water with rough soap made from animal fat and ash. Cooking meant tending a fire constantly, since there were no matches to relight it if it went out. Children were not spared from work. From the age of 5 or 6, they helped in fields, carried firewood, watched animals, or assisted at workshops. Childhood as we know it, time for play, learning, and rest, was rare outside the wealthy classes. Life was ruled not just by the sun, but also by the church. Bells marked the hours of prayer, and holy days punctuated the year. Some historians estimate that peasants had many more feast days than we might expect, days when work paused for religious observance. But these were not vacations in the modern sense. They were filled with services, processions, and rituals. Rest was relative. The work was hard, but there was pride in it too. Crops fed families. Tools shaped communities. Wool and cloth brought warmth in winter. The rhythm of labor bound people together, and without it, survival was impossible. Still, imagine yourself there. The morning begins with carrying water. Then hours of bending in the field, your hands raw from rough stalks of grain. A quick meal of bread and ale offers little energy, but there is no choice. By afternoon you are tired, but the work continues, and the sun still hangs high. At night, your muscles ache, your body feels heavy, and your bed of straw is your only comfort. This endless cycle was the heartbeat of medieval life. For us, one day would feel like punishment. For them, it was simply normal. And even though daily work was exhausting, it was not the only danger. Beyond the fields and workshops lurked a constant threat: disease. A single cough, a spoiled meal, or a flea bite could change everything. That is where we go next, into the dark shadow of medieval sickness. The shadow of disease. After food, after work, after the daily rhythm of survival, there was always another presence in medieval life. It was invisible, silent, and relentless. It was disease. Imagine living in a crowded town where streets are narrow, waste runs in the gutters, and the smell of smoke, sweat, and rot lingers in the air. Houses are packed tightly together, with families and animals often sharing the same small space. In these conditions, sickness did not just spread, it raced. The most infamous example, of course, is the Black Death. In the mid-14th century, the plague swept across Europe, killing millions in only a few years. Entire villages disappeared, churchyards overflowed, and fear hung heavy in the air. But plague was only one of many illnesses people faced. Even without such catastrophes, life expectancy was short. Many children did not survive past their 5th birthday. Fevers, coughs, stomach troubles, things we might treat today with simple medicine, were often deadly. A small cut could fester, a toothache could turn into an infection, and poor hygiene made everything worse. Water was unsafe to drink, and food often carried hidden dangers. Spoiled meat or bread tainted with ergot could poison whole households. Parasites, lice, and fleas were constant companions, scratching at skin and carrying sickness with them. When people fell ill, medicine offered little comfort. Doctors in medieval Europe worked with limited knowledge. They believed sickness was caused by imbalances in the body's humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments often included bleeding the patient, applying leeches, or prescribing strange mixtures of herbs, wine, or even ground-up stones. Some remedies may have helped a little, but many did nothing at all. Hospitals existed, but they were not like the clean medical centers we know today. Most were run by religious orders, and they focused on caring for the soul as much as the body. A sick person might find shelter, food, and prayer, but not necessarily a cure. And then there was superstition. When disease struck, people searched for reasons. Sometimes they blamed bad air, or miasma. Other times they blamed sin, punishment from God, or even witchcraft. Fear could turn neighbor against neighbor, and whole communities might look for scapegoats to explain what they could not understand. The experience of illness was everywhere. Imagine yourself sitting in a dim hut, listening to the coughs of your family through the night. The air is cold but heavy, and you know there is little that can be done. A priest might visit, offering last rites. Candles might flicker by the bedside. Survival is uncertain, and every family has stories of lives cut short. And yet people endured. They learned to live with the constant shadow of sickness. They found small comforts in prayer, in community, and in the simple rhythm of daily life. To them, disease was not an exception, it was part of existence itself. For us, used to medicine, clean water, and vaccinations, a single day in that world would feel terrifying. But for medieval people, it was woven into the fabric of life, as normal as the rising and setting of the sun. Now we have looked at food, bathrooms, work, and disease, the basic struggles that shaped the lives of ordinary people. But medieval history was not only about peasants. There were also lords, kings, and nobles, whose lives looked very different. In the next part, we will turn to their world. We will explore what it was like to live not in a hut of straw, but in a castle of stone. Life in a castle. So far, we have walked through the struggles of ordinary life. The meals of pottage and bread, the chamber pots and streets, the endless hours of labor, and the constant threat of sickness. But not everyone in medieval Europe lived like that. Some people lived in castles, vast stone fortresses that still rise on hillsides today. Life in a castle was different, though not always as glamorous as you might imagine. Imagine yourself approaching one now. The walls are thick and gray, rising above the countryside. A drawbridge stretches over a moat, the wood creaking as carts and horses cross. Soldiers stand at the gate, their armor shining faintly in the light. From a distance, the castle looks strong, even intimidating. Inside, however, it was not always as comfortable as it appears. The Great Hall was the heart of castle life. It was a wide, echoing space, with a high timber roof and a fire burning in a central hearth. Smoke drifted upward, sometimes escaping through a hole in the roof, sometimes clinging to the rafters. Here, meals were served, business was conducted, and entertainment unfolded. You can imagine the long wooden tables, lined with benches, the lord and lady seated at the top, their household gathered below. Food in a castle was far richer than that of the peasants. Roasted meats, fresh fish, spiced dishes, sweet pastries. All could appear on the table, especially on feast days. Servants carried platters, minstrels played gentle tunes, and conversation hummed through the hall. Yet even here there were challenges. Without proper ventilation, the hall was smoky. Without glass windows, drafts swept through. Cleanliness was limited, and pests still found their way into the stores. Bedrooms were another example. A noble might sleep on a bed raised off the ground, covered with furs or embroidered cloth. This was far more comfortable than a peasant's straw mattress, but the cold stone walls made winter nights chilly. Fires and braziers helped, yet the warmth never quite filled the space. Imagine lying beneath heavy covers, hearing the wind whistle through narrow arrow slits, the room both grand and lonely. Daily life in a castle was busy. The lord had duties to oversee, managing lands, resolving disputes among tenants, preparing for war if needed. The lady of the castle often managed the household, supervising servants, overseeing food supplies, and sometimes even defending the walls in the lord's absence. Children of noble birth were educated, learning reading, writing, music, and manners, while boys were trained in riding and arms. Servants and soldiers filled the background. Cooks worked in hot, smoky kitchens, where spits turned over fires and pots simmered with thick stews. Stable hands tended horses, cleaning stalls and preparing saddles. Guards patrolled the walls, their boots echoing on the stone. The castle was a community in itself, alive with sound and movement. But castles were not only homes. They were also fortresses. Every wall, every tower, every gate was designed for defense. In times of peace, this might feel unnecessary, but in times of war, it was a matter of survival. Imagine the sudden clang of bells, the rush of soldiers to the battlements, and villagers from outside crowding into the courtyard for protection. For all its grandeur, castle life still lacked many things we would call comforts. There were no flushing toilets, no soft lighting, no central heating. Meals were better, but hygiene was not much improved. Privacy was rare, as servants and guards moved constantly through the halls. Even for the wealthy, life was shaped by cold, smoke, and uncertainty. And yet, compared to the peasants toiling in fields, life in a castle was far easier. Nobles had food when others starved. They had protection when others were vulnerable. They had opportunities to learn, to travel, and to leave their mark on history. Close your eyes and imagine both worlds side by side. In one, a peasant bends low in a muddy field, hands raw from work, eating a meal of stale bread at the end of the day. In the other, a lord sits at a high table, a cup of spiced wine in hand, as music plays in the smoky hall. This contrast defined medieval society, a sharp divide between those who struggled daily to survive and those who held power. And while castles stood as symbols of wealth and strength, they also carried mysteries. Beneath their stones, secrets still wait to be uncovered. Which leads us into our next journey, the world of medieval archaeology and the strange discoveries buried in the earth. Mysteries beneath the stones. Castles and towns may look silent now, but beneath their walls and streets lie traces of the people who once lived there. Archaeologists have spent decades carefully uncovering these remains, and what they find often tells stories very different from the ones written in old books. Imagine the soil of a medieval town. Layer upon layer of discarded things, broken pottery, old shoes, bones of animals, lost coins, accumulate slowly over centuries. Each fragment is a clue, a whisper from the past. To walk through an archaeological site is to step into the rhythm of lives long gone. One of the most surprising discoveries often comes from cesspits, the very places used to store human waste. While unpleasant to think about, these pits were sealed off and forgotten, which means they preserved whatever was thrown into them. Archaeologists have found shoes with worn soles, children's toys carved from wood, and kitchen scraps that reveal what people really ate. In one case, tiny seeds were discovered, showing that even humble families sometimes added herbs to their pottage. Skeletons tell even more. Excavations in London, York, and other medieval cities have revealed graves packed with the remains of ordinary people. By studying their bones, scientists can see the marks of daily struggle. Arthritis from heavy labor, teeth worn down from gritty bread, and signs of malnutrition in growing children. Sometimes, healed fractures show how people survived accidents, while others reveal injuries that never healed at all. One haunting discovery came from a mass grave uncovered in East Smithfield, London. It contained victims of the Black Death, laid hurriedly side by side. For centuries, this site lay undisturbed beneath the city, until modern archaeologists uncovered it. The remains revealed how sudden and overwhelming the plague had been. It is a quiet reminder of how fragile medieval life could be. But not all finds are grim. Sometimes they reveal moments of human creativity and care. At York, archaeologists found a child's shoe, carefully stitched and repaired many times. It shows not just poverty, but also the love of parents who tried to make the little shoe last. In castles, delicate items like jewelry, combs, and chess pieces appear, reminding us that even in hard times, people valued beauty and play. There are mysteries too, puzzles that remain unsolved. In some castles, hidden rooms or bricked-up passages suggest secrets never written down. Underground tunnels hint at escape routes or secret stores. At times, strange symbols are carved into walls, perhaps to ward off evil spirits. These marks, known as apotropaic symbols, remind us of the fear of unseen forces that haunted medieval minds. Even ordinary items can feel mysterious when seen centuries later. A spoon worn smooth by countless meals, a cracked pot patched again and again, or a fragment of glass once part of a church window. Each object is a bridge to someone who lived, worked, and struggled in that world. Imagine standing in a museum, looking at a bowl that once held pottage, or a key that once opened a wooden chest. These things are quiet, unremarkable in appearance, yet they carry within them the touch of forgotten hands. Archaeology shows us that medieval life was not only about lords and knights. It was about ordinary people, whose voices are rarely found in written records. Through the fragments they left behind, we can hear them again softly, across the centuries. And as we think about these discoveries, another question arises. What did people believe? Beyond their food, their work, and their struggles with disease, what guided their minds and spirits? Religion and faith shaped every part of medieval existence, and exploring that world reveals yet another layer of their daily lives. A world of faith. If there was one thing that touched every corner of medieval life, it was religion. Faith was not just something people practiced on Sundays, it was the framework of existence, shaping the way people thought about life, death, sickness, work, and even the weather. From the smallest village chapel to the grandest cathedral, the church stood at the center of daily life. Its bells marked time, calling people to prayer in the morning, at noon, and at night. Its festivals set the rhythm of the year, with holy days often becoming the only breaks in long stretches of labor. Imagine being a peasant farmer. The harvest is poor, and you fear hunger in the winter. You kneel in the small wooden church, lit only by candles, and pray for better times. Or imagine being a knight, preparing for battle. You confess your sins, take communion, and march forward with the belief that God is watching over you. Faith gave meaning to suffering. For many, hunger, disease, and death were not just random misfortunes. They were seen as part of God's plan, or as punishment for sin, or as tests of endurance. The hope of heaven, with its promise of eternal rest, made daily hardships easier to bear. But religion was not only spiritual, it was also practical. The church owned land, collected tithes, and influenced kings and nobles. A tenth of a peasant's harvest might go to the local priest, even if their own family was hungry. Monasteries held wealth, managed farms, and offered shelter to travelers. Priests recorded births, marriages, and deaths, acting as the keepers of life's milestones. The church also shaped knowledge. Most books were written and copied by monks in monasteries. Education, for those who could access it, was usually tied to religious learning. Even medicine often mixed with prayer, saints, and holy relics. Yet faith was not always peaceful. Disputes between popes and kings shook Europe, and different groups argued over the meaning of scripture. When the church declared certain ideas heretical, the punishment could be harsh, sometimes even deadly. Fear of hell, fear of demons, and fear of witchcraft lingered in many hearts. Still, religion was also a source of beauty. Cathedrals rose high above cities, their stained glass windows glowing with colors that must have seemed almost magical to people used to dark, simple homes. Pilgrimages drew travelers across Europe, walking for weeks to visit holy sites, carrying prayers for healing, forgiveness, or good fortune. At home, faith was woven into small daily acts. People made the sign of the cross before eating, prayed for the souls of the dead, and whispered blessings over newborns. Even the rhythms of farming were linked to saints' days and festivals. For medieval people, the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was thin. The church door was a doorway not only to prayer, but to a larger world where heaven, hell, and earth were closely connected. Now, having seen the role of faith, we can step further inside the walls of monasteries themselves. Their life followed a different rhythm, quiet, strict, and disciplined. It was a world apart, where men and women dedicated their entire lives to prayer and service. Behind monastery walls, monasteries were islands of order in a world often filled with noise, hunger, and conflict. To walk through their gates was to step into a life ruled not by chance or the seasons, but by the steady rhythm of prayer and discipline. A monk's day began before the sun rose. The first bell called them from their beds in the dark hours, and they gathered in the chapel for morning prayers, their voices rising together in Latin chants. These prayers were repeated several times a day, breaking time into sacred moments. Work filled the hours between services. Some monks worked in fields, tending sheep, cows, or crops. Others copied books, sitting in chilly scriptoria where the only sound was the scratch of quills on parchment. These books included not only scripture, but also ancient works of medicine, philosophy, and history, which might have been lost if not for the monks who carefully preserved them. Silence was important in many monasteries. Meals were often eaten quietly, while one monk read aloud from a holy text. Food was simple: bread, vegetables, and sometimes fish, but rarely meat. The idea was not to enjoy life's pleasures, but to live with discipline and focus on the soul. Not every moment was solemn. Monks tended gardens, brewed ale, made cheese, and kept bees for honey. Monasteries were almost like small, self-sufficient villages with workshops, kitchens, barns, and infirmaries. They provided shelter for travelers and care for the sick and poor. Nuns lived similar lives in convents, with the same focus on prayer, service, and community. They might also weave cloth, teach children, or tend herb gardens. For many women, the convent was one of the few places where they could read, write, and live apart from marriage. Life in a monastery was strict, but it also offered stability. For peasants outside the walls, life was uncertain, with harvests failing, wars breaking out, and taxes rising. Inside the monastery, days followed a steady pattern, and in some ways it must have felt safer. But it was not always peaceful. Some monasteries grew wealthy, owning vast lands and collecting rents from peasants. This sometimes drew resentment. In troubled times, monasteries were attacked, burned, or looted. Even within the cloister, monks sometimes argued about rules, discipline, or the temptations of wealth. Still, the image of monks bent over their books or standing in quiet prayer has lasted for centuries. Their labor preserved much of the knowledge of the ancient world. Without their work, we might know far less about history, science, and literature. To imagine their world is to picture stone walls, candlelight, the sound of chanting echoing through high arches, and the smell of herbs drying in the gardens. It was a life apart, where every hour belonged to God. But outside those walls, the rhythm of ordinary towns continued, bustling and noisy. To see medieval life fully, we must step back into the streets, where merchants, craftsmen, and children filled the air with energy. Life in the marketplace. If monasteries were places of order and silence, towns were the opposite, full of noise, smells, and constant activity. Markets were the heartbeat of medieval urban life, drawing people from nearby villages and distant lands. Picture a town square on market day. The streets are narrow and crooked, lined with wooden houses that lean toward each other as if whispering secrets. Stalls fill the open spaces, covered with cloth awnings to shield goods from sun or rain. Merchants shout out their wares, chickens flap underfoot, and the smell of spices, fish, bread, and animals mixes in the air. For peasants, markets were vital. This was where they sold extra grain, eggs, or wool to earn money for tools, salt, or cloth. For townsfolk, it was where they bought almost everything. Shoes, pots, candles, and even medicine could all be found here. Markets were also places of exchange beyond goods. News traveled quickly in the crowded streets. Gossip, stories of battles, rumors about kings, and tales from faraway lands all passed from mouth to mouth. A traveler from another region might bring not only goods, but also new ideas. Craftsmen set up workshops nearby, each street sometimes belonging to one trade. One road might be full of blacksmiths, hammering at glowing iron, while another echoed with the rhythm of looms weaving cloth. Guilds controlled many of these trades, setting rules about quality, prices, and training for apprentices. Markets could also be dangerous. Pickpockets worked the crowds, disease spread easily, and quarrels sometimes flared into fights. Laws tried to bring order, with town guards keeping watch and officials checking weights and measures to prevent cheating. Still, disputes were common. Fairs were even bigger than weekly markets. Held once or twice a year, they attracted merchants from far away, sometimes traveling from other countries. These great gatherings filled towns with color, music, and excitement. A peasant who never traveled more than a few miles from home might see goods from Italy, Flanders, or even the East. Life in towns was lively, but it also had problems. Streets were often dirty, with waste thrown from windows and animals wandering freely. Houses were cramped and dark, built close together, so fire was a constant danger. Water supplies were limited, and many drank weak ale instead, since it was safer than untreated water. Despite these challenges, towns gave people opportunities. A successful craftsman might grow wealthy, a merchant might rise in status, and even peasants could sometimes escape the rigid life of farming by moving inside the town walls. Freedom and choice, rare in the countryside, were easier to find here. The town square, noisy and crowded, stood in sharp contrast to the quiet chapel of a monastery. Together, they show how diverse medieval life could be. One world of prayer and silence, another of trade and chatter. But whether in towns or villages, people's lives were always shaped by the seasons, by harvests, and by the land itself. To understand their world, we must look more closely at the homes they lived in and the struggles they faced within them. Inside a medieval home. When we think of the Middle Ages, it is easy to picture castles or cathedrals, but most people lived in simple houses. For peasants, a home was often a single room built of wood, mud, or wattle and daub with a thatched roof. The walls were thin, the floors were made of packed earth, and smoke from the cooking fire drifted through the air, since many cottages had no chimney. In these small homes, life was crowded. Parents, children, and sometimes grandparents all shared the same space. Animals might also sleep inside during cold nights, especially chickens, goats, or even a cow. This kept the animals safe from thieves and wolves, and their warmth helped heat the room. The hearth, or open fire, was the heart of the house. Here food was cooked in pots hung over the flames, and here families gathered for warmth and light. Furniture was simple, wooden stools, benches, or maybe a table. Beds were often straw mattresses laid on the floor, with wool blankets or animal skins for warmth. For wealthier townsfolk, homes were larger, sometimes with 2 floors. The lower floor might be used as a shop or workshop, while the family lived upstairs. These houses were built of timber frames filled with plaster, and they leaned forward so far that upper floors almost touched across narrow streets. In castles or manor houses, lords and ladies lived in greater comfort, though even there it was not what we might expect today. A great hall served as the main living space, where meals were eaten, servants slept, and visitors were received. Private chambers were rare luxuries, and even in grand homes, drafts, smoke, and noise were common. Heating was a constant problem. Fires warmed only a small area, and stone walls kept in the cold. In winter, people wore layers of clothing indoors and went to bed early, huddling under blankets. Candles and oil lamps gave light, but they were expensive, so many families relied on daylight as much as possible. Cleanliness was another challenge. Floors were often covered in rushes, which were replaced only a few times a year. Food scraps, bones, and other waste might be thrown on the floor, where dogs or cats picked at them. Over time, the rushes grew dirty, making homes smell unpleasant. Wealthier households sometimes sprinkled herbs or flowers among the rushes to improve the scent. Privacy, as we think of it today, barely existed. Families slept close together, servants shared spaces with their masters, and doors were often left open to neighbors or travelers. Life was lived more publicly, with fewer boundaries between people. Despite the hardships, homes were full of activity. Women spun wool, baked bread, and brewed ale. Children helped with chores, carrying water, gathering firewood, or caring for animals. Neighbors often dropped in, since communities were tightly knit and daily life depended on cooperation. To imagine a medieval home is to think of dim light, smoky air, crowded rooms, and the sound of constant work. It was not comfortable by modern standards, but it was the center of family life, where survival began each day. Yet home life could change quickly when war, disease, or famine struck. And of all these dangers, none terrified people more than the great plagues that swept across Europe. The terror of disease and the plague. If there was one fear that united everyone in the Middle Ages, rich or poor, it was disease. Sickness could strike at any time, and without modern medicine, Even a small wound or a fever might turn deadly. Everyday illnesses were common. Coughs, fevers, stomach pains, and infections spread quickly in crowded homes and dirty streets. Water often carried diseases since it was mixed with waste, and food could easily spoil. People did not understand germs, so they blamed sickness on bad air, sinful behavior, or even the position of the stars. The most dreaded of all illnesses was the plague. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killed millions. Whole villages vanished, and towns lost half their people in only a few months. Victims often developed swellings called buboes, burning fevers, and a deep sense of despair. Death came quickly, sometimes in only a few days. Imagine the fear. Bells tolling constantly for the dead, carts carrying bodies through the streets, and families locked inside their homes, unsure if they would survive. Priests walked from house to house, offering prayers for the dying, while doctors wore strange bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, believing sweet smells could block the sickness. But plague was not the only danger. Leprosy, a disease that caused skin sores and nerve damage, forced victims to live apart from society, often in special houses outside towns. Smallpox, measles, and other epidemics also struck in waves, leaving scars on those who survived. Without knowledge of germs, treatments were often strange. Some believed bleeding the patient with leeches or knives could remove bad blood. Others tried herbs, charms, or pilgrimages to holy sites. Sometimes, desperate families blamed outsiders, leading to suspicion and persecution of groups like Jews, who were wrongly accused of poisoning wells. In monasteries, monks cared for the sick in infirmaries, offering what little treatment they could, mostly prayers, herbs, and simple rest. Some of these medical traditions, passed down from ancient Greece and Rome, kept alive fragments of knowledge that would later grow into modern medicine. Surviving disease was often a matter of luck. A child might die young, while another grew strong. Life expectancy was short, often less than 40 years, though those who reached adulthood sometimes lived longer. The shadow of disease shaped how people lived, how they prayed, and how they thought about death. The church promised hope of salvation, so faith became even more important when sickness spread. Many believed plagues were punishments from God, reminders of human weakness. The constant presence of death made life more fragile, but also more urgent. People clung to family, faith, and community, knowing how quickly it could all be taken away. And while disease frightened everyone, war was another constant danger. Armies marched across fields and through villages, leaving destruction behind them. To understand medieval life fully, we must look next at the battlefield and the warriors who fought there. Life on the medieval battlefield. For many in the Middle Ages, war was not a distant story. It could arrive suddenly, with banners on the horizon and the sound of horns and drums. Kings and nobles fought for land, power, and honor, while ordinary people were drawn into their struggles as soldiers, laborers, or victims. A medieval army was a mix of knights, foot soldiers, and archers. Knights rode on horseback, protected by armor and armed with lances, swords, or maces. They were the elite warriors, trained from boyhood in combat. Their armor was heavy, first made of chainmail, later of full steel plates. Shining knights might seem glamorous in stories, but in battle they faced mud, exhaustion, and sudden death. Foot soldiers, often peasants or lower-born men, fought with spears, axes, or simple farming tools. Many wore little or no armor, making them vulnerable. Archers were especially feared, particularly the English longbowmen, whose arrows could pierce armor from a great distance. Battles were brutal. The clash of steel, the cries of men, and the thunder of horses filled the air. Mud and blood mixed on the ground. Victory often depended not only on skill, but on discipline and numbers. Once a line broke, soldiers could be cut down as they fled. Sieges were even more common than open battles. Castles and walled towns were hard to capture, so armies surrounded them, cutting off supplies until hunger forced surrender. Inside the walls, families endured months of fear, eating whatever they could find. Outside, attackers built wooden towers, hurled stones with catapults, or tried to dig tunnels to collapse the walls. For ordinary villagers, war was a nightmare. Armies raided the countryside, burning fields, stealing livestock, and leaving famine behind. Men were taken to fight, women and children left vulnerable. War was not just fought between soldiers. It tore apart the lives of common people who had little power to resist. Knights followed codes of chivalry in theory, promising to protect the weak and honor the church, but in practice, warfare was cruel. Prisoners could be ransomed for money, but those too poor to pay were often killed. Looting was expected, a way for soldiers to reward themselves. The church tried to limit violence with rules like the peace of God and the truce of God, which forbade fighting on certain holy days, but these were rarely obeyed. War was too deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life. Still, stories of knights and battles became legends, told in songs and poems. Heroes like King Arthur or Roland inspired dreams of bravery and honor, even if the reality was much harsher. For a peasant watching soldiers march past, war was less about glory and more about survival. And while war shaped kingdoms, another force shaped daily life just as strongly: the church. Religion was not just a belief, it was the center of every medieval community. The power of the church. If there was one force that touched every corner of medieval life, it was the church. From the smallest village chapel to the grandest cathedral, religion shaped how people thought, worked, and even how they understood time itself. The church was more than a place to pray. It was the center of the community. Most villages had a church at their heart, and bells rang out to mark the hours, calling people to worship, to work, or to rest. Sunday was the holy day, when almost everyone gathered for Massachusetts. For many peasants, it was their only break from endless labor. Life was guided by the church's calendar. Saints' days, feast days, and holy seasons like Lent and Advent gave rhythm to the year. These days often brought fairs, festivals, and special meals, offering rare moments of joy in otherwise hard lives. But the church was also a powerful institution. Priests not only led prayers but also recorded births, marriages, and deaths. Monks and nuns copied books, kept knowledge alive, and ran schools. Bishops and abbots controlled vast lands, making the church one of the largest landowners in Europe. Faith offered comfort in a world filled with hunger, war, and disease. Heaven promised eternal peace, while hell warned of punishment for sins. To reach salvation, people confessed their sins, did penance, and followed church teachings. Pilgrimages to holy sites, like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, were popular acts of devotion. For those who could afford it, building a cathedral or giving money to a monastery was seen as a way to secure favor with God. These great buildings, with soaring arches and stained glass, were not only religious centers but also symbols of wealth and power. The church also influenced politics. Kings needed the blessing of the Pope, and disputes between rulers and the church could shake entire kingdoms. At times, popes even called for holy wars, like the Crusades, sending thousands of knights and peasants to fight in distant lands. Religion shaped daily habits, too. People prayed before meals, wore crosses or relics for protection, and feared excommunication, which meant being cut off from the church and the community. Superstition blended with faith, as charms, holy water, and blessings were believed to keep away evil. Of course, not everyone agreed with the church. From time to time, people spoke out against its wealth or corruption. These voices, often silenced, hinted at future changes, but in the medieval world, the church's power was almost absolute. Faith, hope, and fear of the afterlife guided every life decision. For peasants, nobles, and kings alike, the church was a constant presence, from the cradle to the grave. And while religion gave order and meaning, another part of medieval life was far less comforting: the punishments and justice system that awaited those who broke the rules. Law and punishment in the Middle Ages. In medieval times, justice was harsh and often terrifying. The idea was simple: punishments should scare people so badly that they would think twice before breaking the law. There were no police forces like we have today, only sheriffs, lords, or church officials trying to keep order. For small crimes, punishments could be humiliating. A thief might be locked in the stocks, a wooden frame that held the hands and head, leaving the criminal exposed in the town square. People threw rotten food, mud, or even stones at them. Sometimes a person was tied to a pillory or had to wear a sign describing their crime. Shame was meant to be part of the punishment. For more serious crimes, things turned brutal. A thief might lose a hand. A liar or a blasphemer might have their tongue cut out. Branding with hot irons was common, marking criminals for life. Some punishments were meant to be both painful and permanent reminders. Executions were public events. Hanging was the most common method, though nobles might be beheaded with a sword or axe. Traitors could face far worse, including being drawn and quartered. These spectacles were meant to warn the crowd. Disobey the law, and this could happen to you. Not all cases went to court with evidence and witnesses. Instead, some relied on trial by ordeal. This meant testing the accused in ways believed to reveal God's judgment. A person might have to carry a red-hot iron or plunge their hand into boiling water. If the wounds healed cleanly, they were declared innocent. If not, they were guilty. In other ordeals, people were thrown into water. If they floated, they were guilty, since water was thought to reject sinners. For disputes over land or honor, trial by combat was sometimes used. Two men fought, and the winner was believed to have God's favor. This could be deadly, but it was accepted as fair by many. The church had its own system of justice, called canon law. Clergy who committed crimes were often tried in church courts, which were usually more lenient. Some criminals even claimed to be clergy just to escape harsher punishments. Despite the cruelty, medieval justice was not only about punishment. There were also fines, compensation payments to victims, and local juries. In small villages, disputes were sometimes settled by elders rather than formal courts. But for those who crossed the line, fear of the stocks, the whip, or the noose was very real. Law and punishment were not just about order, they were about control. Lords, kings, and the church all wanted to show their authority. To live in the Middle Ages was to live under constant rules, and breaking them could cost you everything. Yet while justice was harsh, the medieval world also found room for fun, celebration, and laughter. Festivals and entertainment gave people relief from the heavy weight of daily life. Festivals and entertainment. Life in the Middle Ages was full of hardship, but it was not all work and punishment. People needed joy, laughter, and moments to forget their struggles. Festivals, fairs, and entertainment brought color and excitement into lives that were often gray and repetitive. The church calendar shaped many of these celebrations. Christmas and Easter were the biggest holy days, marked with special meals, plays, and music. But dozens of saints' days also gave communities reasons to gather, feast, and rest. Some were deeply religious, while others blended faith with fun. Carnival, the season before Lent, was especially lively. In some towns, people wore masks, sang songs, and mocked authority. It was a chance to turn the world upside down before weeks of fasting and prayer. Markets and fairs were another kind of festival. Merchants traveled from far and wide, filling streets with stalls of spices, cloth, jewelry, and strange goods many villagers had never seen before. Jugglers, musicians, and storytellers entertained crowds. For peasants, these events offered not just shopping, but a taste of a bigger world beyond their village. Music and dance were part of everyday life. People played simple instruments like drums, fiddles, or flutes. At weddings and festivals, whole communities danced in circles or lines. Nobles enjoyed more refined entertainment with lutes, harps, and poetry performed in grand halls. Games and sports added more fun. Children played with wooden toys, balls, or even animal bones. Adults enjoyed dice games, wrestling, and archery contests. In villages, football was played, but it was nothing like the sport today. Hundreds of people might chase a ball through fields, streets, and rivers, and injuries were common. For the nobility, tournaments were the grandest form of entertainment. Knights jousted on horseback, charging at each other with lances. Crowds cheered, banners waved, and winners gained fame and fortune. Jousts were dangerous, but they were thrilling to watch. Storytelling was another favorite pastime. Minstrels and troubadours traveled from place to place, reciting tales of heroes, saints, or love. These stories kept history and legend alive. Some became so popular that they spread across Europe, shaping medieval culture for centuries. Festivals also gave people a break from strict rules. On certain days, the Feast of Fools or similar celebrations allowed peasants to dress as nobles and children to mock their elders. For a short time, laughter and mischief replaced discipline and order. These moments of joy were essential. Life was often short and difficult, so festivals and entertainment gave people energy and hope. They brought communities together, reminding everyone that there was more to life than toil and fear. But while peasants celebrated in the streets, nobles and kings were enjoying far greater luxuries in their castles. And their lives looked very different from the hard-working villagers below. Noble life in castles. Castles dominate our imagination when we think of the Middle Ages. They rise from hillsides with stone towers and thick walls, symbols of strength and authority. But what was it really like to live inside one? For nobles, life in a castle was a strange mix of luxury, duty, and discomfort. A castle was not just a home, it was also a fortress. Its main purpose was defense. Thick walls, narrow windows, and moats made it difficult for enemies to attack. Inside, the lord and his family lived with servants, soldiers, and sometimes hundreds of people. The castle was a small world of its own, buzzing with activity. Daily life for a noble was far removed from that of peasants. Nobles had access to rich food, fine clothing, and decorated halls. Meals were served on long tables covered with meat, bread, cheese, and spiced wine. Exotic foods like sugar, almonds, or citrus fruit were rare treats imported from faraway lands. Yet castles were not always comfortable. Rooms could be cold, smoky, and dimly lit. Even nobles sometimes shivered in winter, with only tapestries on the walls and small fires for warmth. Privacy was limited, since most people shared rooms with family or servants. The lord of the castle had responsibilities beyond feasting. He oversaw lands, collected taxes, settled disputes, and made sure soldiers were ready to defend the estate. Hunting was a favorite pastime, but it was also training for war. A noble was expected to be both a ruler and a warrior. For noble women, life centered on managing the household. A lady of the castle supervised servants, organized feasts, and sometimes controlled estates when her husband was away. Some women learned to read and write, and a few even became powerful leaders, though most were expected to focus on family and faith. Castles also served as centers of culture. Troubadours performed songs of love and chivalry. Minstrels entertained with tales of legendary knights. Noble children were trained in manners, music, and sometimes reading, though boys were also taught the arts of war. Defending the castle was always a concern. Soldiers trained with weapons, guards patrolled walls, and watchtowers scanned the horizon. In times of war, life became tense. Villagers from the countryside sometimes crowded inside the castle for protection, and supplies had to be rationed. Despite the harsh realities, life in a castle was far more privileged than life in a hut. Nobles lived above the struggles of peasants, enjoying wealth, power, and influence. Yet they too faced dangers, from rival lords to disease, and even kings who might see them as threats. Castles were not just homes. They were symbols of authority and control, towering reminders of who ruled the land. And at the very top of society, above even the lords and ladies, was the monarch who commanded them all. Kings and queens. At the highest point of medieval society stood the monarch, the king or queen who ruled over the realm. Their crowns glittered with jewels, their courts were filled with nobles, and their names carried power far beyond their castles. But royal life, though rich and glamorous on the surface, was far from easy or carefree. A king's main duty was to rule and protect his kingdom. This meant making laws, collecting taxes, leading armies, and keeping order among restless nobles. Many kings spent more time on horseback, traveling between castles and battlefields, than sitting on a throne. The image of a king in shining robes at a banquet was only one part of his life. The other was long hours of war, diplomacy, and politics. Queens played different roles depending on their time and country. Some were expected to simply bear heirs and support their husbands. Others acted as advisors, regents, or even rulers in their own right. Strong queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Isabella of France influenced politics, led armies, and shaped history as much as kings did. The royal court was the center of power. Here, nobles gathered to seek favors, ambassadors negotiated treaties, and entertainers performed for the royal family. Feasts in a royal hall were grand spectacles, with dozens of dishes, music, and pageantry. To be invited was an honor, and to fall out of favor could mean ruin. But being royal was also dangerous. Kings had to constantly defend their crowns from rivals, rebellious lords, and even their own families. Plots, betrayals, and assassinations were common. Thrones changed hands through war and intrigue, and many kings died young in battle or at the hands of enemies. Royal children were raised not for comfort, but for duty. Princes were trained in warfare and politics, while princesses were often married off to form alliances with other kingdoms. A child's life could change overnight if their father died, and they suddenly became ruler. Despite their power, kings and queens were not above the problems of medieval life. They too faced disease, poor medical care, and the threat of famine or rebellion. They had wealth, but no guarantee of peace. A crown was as much a burden as it was a prize. Still, monarchs shaped the world around them. Their decisions could change the fate of thousands, whether by declaring war, raising taxes, or granting freedoms. They were symbols of authority, chosen by birth, and often believed to rule by God's will. Life at the top of society was glamorous compared to that of peasants and even nobles, but it was also full of pressure, responsibility, and danger. And while kings and queens ruled from stone palaces and golden thrones, most people lived in much humbler surroundings. Towns and city life. When we picture the Middle Ages, we often think of castles and villages. But another important part of medieval society was the town. Towns were smaller than modern cities, but they were lively, crowded, and full of opportunity. They were also dirty, smelly, and sometimes dangerous. Most medieval towns grew around markets, crossroads, or rivers. Trade was the heart of town life. Merchants set up stalls in the marketplace, selling everything from wool and grain to imported goods like spices and silk. Markets were noisy and colorful, with sellers shouting, buyers bargaining, and animals wandering between the crowds. Towns were tightly packed with wooden houses built close together, often with upper floors sticking out over the street. Roads were narrow, muddy, and rarely paved. There were no garbage systems, so waste often ended up in the street. People tossed dirty water from windows, and chamber pots were emptied outside. The smell could be overwhelming, especially in summer. Life in towns was busy. Craftsmen like blacksmiths, shoemakers, and bakers had their workshops on the ground floor of their homes, while their families lived upstairs. Guilds, which were groups of craftsmen in the same trade, helped regulate quality and prices, and they supported members during hard times. Towns offered more freedom than villages. Peasants who escaped from a manor and lived in a town for a year and a day could sometimes become free. This rule made towns attractive to those seeking a new life. With freedom came responsibility, though, since towns often had their own laws and councils. Crowds meant risks. Fire was one of the greatest dangers in medieval towns. Wooden houses and open hearths could easily spark blazes that destroyed entire neighborhoods. Disease also spread quickly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Outbreaks of plague or sickness could wipe out large parts of the population. Despite the dangers, towns were exciting places. They were centers of trade, learning, and culture. Universities were founded in towns like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, attracting scholars from across Europe. Cathedrals and churches dominated skylines, serving as both religious and social centers. Entertainment also flourished. Fairs, festivals, and mystery plays filled streets with music, dancing, and theater. Traveling performers entertained crowds with juggling, acrobatics, and storytelling. For many people, these events were the highlight of the year. Living in a town was not easy, but it offered chances that peasants in the countryside could only dream of. Here, a clever merchant might become wealthy, a scholar might learn enough to change the world, and an ordinary person might build a new life of freedom. Trade and merchants. Trade was the lifeblood of medieval towns and a key part of Europe's economy. Without trade, towns would have been little more than clusters of houses, but with it they became bustling centers of activity. Merchants, those who bought and sold goods, were the driving force behind this change. In the early Middle Ages, most trade was local. Farmers sold grain, eggs, or wool in the nearest market, and craftsmen sold shoes, pots, or tools. But as time passed, long-distance trade expanded. By the 12th and 13th centuries, merchants were traveling across Europe and even beyond, bringing in goods that peasants and nobles alike had never seen before. Spices from the east, like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, were especially prized. They were expensive, sometimes worth their weight in gold, and they added flavor to diets that were otherwise plain and repetitive. Silk from China, glass from Venice, furs from Russia, and salt from the mines of Central Europe were also highly valued. Merchants organized themselves into guilds, just like craftsmen. These merchant guilds controlled trade in towns, protected members from unfair competition, and helped solve disputes. Some towns also formed trade leagues, such as the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe, which linked dozens of cities together for mutual protection and profit. Markets and fairs were the heart of trade. Weekly markets served local needs, but great fairs, like those in Champagne in France, drew merchants from across the continent. At these fairs, goods were exchanged, business deals were made, and moneylenders provided loans to finance large shipments. They were noisy, crowded, and exciting events. Being a merchant was not an easy life. Travel was dangerous, with poor roads, bandits, and the risk of shipwreck. Merchants also had to deal with taxes and tolls collected at every border or bridge. Yet the rewards could be great. A successful merchant might become wealthy, powerful, and even rise into the ranks of the nobility. Trade also brought new ideas and cultures. Contact with the Islamic world during the Crusades introduced Europeans to new products, medical knowledge, and technology. The growth of trade helped spark changes that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. Of course, not everyone welcomed merchants. Some people distrusted them, accusing them of greed or dishonesty. The church sometimes frowned on lending money with interest, which it considered sinful. Still, trade continued to grow, and merchants became some of the most influential people in medieval society. In the end, trade connected the medieval world. From tiny village markets to great seaports, goods moved, ideas spread, and society slowly changed. The merchant's cart and the trader's ship carried not just products, but the seeds of a new future. Peasants and serfs. The vast majority of people in medieval Europe were peasants. They lived on the land, worked the fields, and supported the entire system with their labor. Without them, nobles could not build castles, knights could not fight wars, and kings could not rule. Yet peasants themselves lived lives of hard work, little comfort, and few rights. Not all peasants were the same. Some were free peasants who rented land from a lord and had more independence. Others were serfs, bound to the land and unable to leave without permission. Serfs were not slaves, but they were tied to their lord's estate. If the land was sold, they went with it. Daily life was centered on farming. Men, women, and children all worked in the fields. Plowing, sowing, and harvesting took up much of the year. Tools were simple, mostly wooden plows, hoes, and sickles. Oxen or horses provided power, but much of the work was done by hand. Weather could make the difference between survival and hunger. Life was not only work. Peasants also had to pay taxes, both to their lord and to the church. Lords demanded labor services on their land or a share of the harvest. The church collected tithes, usually 1/10 of everything produced. After all these payments, peasants often had little left for themselves. Houses were small and rough. Most peasants lived in one-room cottages made of wood, clay, and thatch. Animals often shared the space for warmth. Smoke from the hearth filled the room, since chimneys were rare. Furniture was basic, usually just stools, benches, and maybe a simple bed stuffed with straw. Clothing was plain and practical. Wool was the main fabric, spun and woven at home. Shoes were simple leather, if peasants had any at all. In cold weather, cloaks and hoods provided some protection, but winters could still be harsh. Food was meager and repetitive. Bread, porridge, and vegetables formed the bulk of the diet. Meat was rare, usually eaten only at festivals or when hunting small animals. Ale was the common drink, since water was often unsafe. For peasants, eating was about survival, not variety. Despite the hardships, peasants formed close-knit communities. Villages worked together on tasks like plowing fields or repairing buildings. Festivals, holy days, and village gatherings gave chances to rest, celebrate, and share stories. Life was difficult, but it was not entirely joyless. For serfs, freedom was limited. They could not move to a town or marry without the lord's approval. However, over time, some managed to save enough to buy their freedom. Others escaped to towns where the rule of a year and a day sometimes turned them into free citizens. Peasants and serfs may have lived at the bottom of the medieval hierarchy, but they were the backbone of society. Their labor kept everyone else fed and clothed. In many ways, the story of the Middle Ages is the story of these ordinary people, whose names were rarely recorded, but whose work sustained a whole civilization. Knights and chivalry. When we picture the Middle Ages, one of the first images that comes to mind is the knight in armor, riding a horse and carrying a lance. Knights were more than just soldiers. They were a special warrior class, tied to the ideals of loyalty, honor, and service. But as we'll see, the reality of knighthood was not always as glamorous as the legends suggest. Knights were mounted warriors, trained in the art of combat from a young age. A boy from a noble family might begin as a page at around 7 years old, serving in a lord's household, learning manners, basic fighting, and the care of weapons and horses. Around 14, he would become a squire, assisting a knight directly. He practiced swordplay, jousting, and battlefield skills. If he proved himself, usually by age 21, he could be dubbed a knight in a solemn ceremony. Armor and weapons were essential. Early knights wore chainmail, but by the later Middle Ages they wore full suits of plate armor that could weigh up to 60 pounds. They carried swords, shields, and lances for mounted combat. Horses were trained for war too, powerful animals that could charge into enemy lines. The cost of all this equipment was enormous, which is why only nobles or wealthy families could afford to make their sons knights. Knights were bound by the code of chivalry, an ideal of behavior that included loyalty to one's lord. protection of the weak, courtesy to women, and devotion to God. Chivalry was part moral guide, part public image. It inspired countless stories, like those of King Arthur and his Round Table, where knights went on quests for justice and glory. But reality was often harsher. Knights could be brutal on the battlefield. Wars were bloody, villages were burned, and ordinary peasants often suffered most. Chivalry sometimes applied more to how knights treated other nobles than to how they treated common people. For example, captured knights might be ransomed for money, while peasant soldiers were simply killed. Tournaments and justs added a different side to knighthood. These events were part sport, part training, and part entertainment. Knights showed off their skills in front of crowds, charging with lances or dueling with swords. Victories brought fame and sometimes even wealth. Religion also played a role in knighthood. The idea of the Christian knight was strong, especially during the Crusades, when knights saw themselves as defenders of the faith. Orders like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers combined the roles of monk and warrior, fighting in the Holy Land while living under religious vows. By the late Middle Ages, the role of knights began to decline. Advances in weapons, like the longbow and later gunpowder, reduced the effectiveness of heavy cavalry. Professional armies, paid by kings, replaced feudal knights. Still, the image of the knight lived on in literature and legend, shaping ideas of honor and heroism long after their battlefield role had faded. Knighthood was both privilege and duty. It offered glory but demanded sacrifice. For medieval society, the knight stood as a symbol of strength, loyalty, and the values, real or imagined, that defined an age. Castles. Castles are one of the most recognizable symbols of the Middle Ages. They were not just grand homes for nobles, but also strongholds of defense, centers of administration, and statements of power. To live near a castle was to live under its shadow, for better or for worse. Early medieval castles were simple wooden fortresses, often called motte and bailey castles. A motte was a mound of earth topped by a wooden tower, while the bailey was a courtyard surrounded by a wooden fence. These could be built quickly, which was useful in a time of constant raids and wars, but would burn easily, so over time, stone replaced timber, creating the massive stone castles we think of today. A stone castle was designed for defense. Thick walls, often several meters thick, could withstand attacks. Towers gave defenders a high vantage point to fire arrows. Moats, drawbridges, and gatehouses added layers of protection. Inside, narrow staircases and winding passages slowed attackers who managed to breach the walls. Every detail of the design aimed to make invasion as difficult as possible. But castles were more than military structures. They were also homes for nobles and their families. Inside the walls, there were halls for feasting, chapels for worship, kitchens, storerooms, and living quarters. Life in a castle was more comfortable than life in a peasant's cottage, but it was still cold, smoky, and drafty. Fireplaces provided warmth, but large halls could never be truly cozy. Castles also served as centers of local government. From a castle, a lord controlled the surrounding lands, collected taxes, and administered justice. Villagers brought disputes to the castle court, and criminals might find themselves locked in the castle's dungeons. The lord's power was made visible by the towering presence of his fortress. For peasants, castles were both protection and burden. In times of war, villagers could take shelter within the castle walls, safe from raiding armies. But castles were also symbols of control, reminders that they owed labor and taxes to the lord who ruled from within. Castles changed over time. By the late Middle Ages, they became less about military defense and more about display. As gunpowder weapons made walls less effective, castles transformed into palaces, emphasizing luxury and comfort instead of fortification. The grandeur of these later castles reflected wealth and prestige rather than the need for safety. Today, many castles survive as ruins or restored monuments. They remind us of a world where stone walls and towers defined landscapes and lives, and where power was built not only on armies but on the strength of stone. Medieval towns and trade. For much of the early Middle Ages, Europe was mostly rural. People lived in villages, farming the land and rarely traveling far. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, towns began to grow, and with them came trade, markets, and a new kind of energy that changed medieval life. Towns often began near castles, monasteries, or river crossings, places where people already gathered for safety or worship. Merchants saw opportunities, and soon markets sprang up. A weekly market allowed peasants to sell surplus goods, while traders brought in items from other regions. Over time, these markets attracted more permanent settlers, and villages grew into towns. Medieval towns were crowded and noisy. Streets were narrow and often muddy. Houses were built close together, sometimes leaning over the street so that the upper floors nearly touched. Shops lined the streets, with craftsmen working on the ground floor and living with their families above. Smells of food, smoke, and waste mixed in the air, since sanitation was poor and garbage often ended up in the streets. Markets were at the heart of town life. You could find fresh bread, salted fish, cloth, pottery, and even spices brought from distant lands. A busy fair might also feature entertainers like jugglers, musicians, and storytellers. For many villagers, visiting a town market was a rare and exciting event. Guilds played an important role in towns. A guild was an association of people who worked in the same trade, like bakers, blacksmiths, or weavers. Guilds set standards for quality, controlled prices, and trained apprentices. They also supported members in times of need, acting as both business organizations and social groups. Trade connected towns to the wider world. Italian cities like Venice and Genoa traded across the Mediterranean, bringing in silk and spices from the east. Northern towns joined the Hanseatic League, a powerful network of merchants that controlled trade in the Baltic and North Seas. These connections brought wealth, but also rivalry, as towns competed for influence. Towns offered opportunities that did not exist in the countryside. A peasant who managed to live in a town for a year and a day without being claimed by their lord could gain freedom. This idea was captured in the saying, "Town air makes you free." For ambitious people, towns provided a chance to rise above their birth. Of course, towns had their dangers. Fires could spread quickly through wooden houses. Disease was a constant threat in crowded, unsanitary streets. The Black Death, for example, struck towns especially hard, wiping out entire neighborhoods. Despite the risks, towns became centers of innovation, trade, and culture. They changed the balance of medieval society, shifting power away from feudal lords and toward merchants and craftsmen. In many ways, the growth of towns paved the way for the modern world. The church in daily life. If there was one constant presence in the life of medieval people, it was the church. From the grand cathedrals that dominated town skylines to the smallest village chapels, the church shaped how people thought, lived, and even how they died. It was not just a religion, but also a powerful social and political force. For peasants, the church was woven into daily routine. The sound of church bells marked time, calling people to prayer, to work, or to rest. Every week, villagers gathered for Mass, where they heard the teachings of the Bible. Since most could not read, sermons and paintings on church walls were their main source of learning about faith. The church provided guidance at every stage of life. Babies were baptized, couples were married, and the dead were buried with prayers. Festivals, saints' days, and holy days filled the calendar, giving peasants a break from endless labor. Christmas, Easter, and local feast days brought both worship and celebration, binding communities together. Monasteries played an important role as centers of learning and charity. Monks and nuns copied books, cared for the sick, and offered shelter to travelers. Some monasteries became wealthy through land ownership, while others lived in strict poverty, devoting themselves to prayer. Either way, monasteries were among the few places where literacy and knowledge were carefully preserved. The church also held immense political power. Bishops and abbots controlled vast lands, sometimes rivaling kings in influence. Popes could crown emperors, excommunicate rulers, or even call for crusades. In many ways, the church stood above kings and lords, acting as the supreme authority in Europe. Yet the church was not without criticism. Corruption, wealth, and abuses of power troubled many believers. The selling of indulgences, where people paid for forgiveness of sins, was one of the practices that later led to reform movements. Still, in the Middle Ages, challenging the church was rare and often dangerous. For ordinary people, the church was a source of comfort in a difficult world. Life was hard, uncertain, and often short. Faith gave meaning to suffering, and the hope of heaven made the struggles of daily existence bearable. The church promised not just rules for living, but also salvation for the soul. In the end, the church was more than a building or an institution. It was the rhythm of life itself, shaping time, law, art, and thought. To understand the Middle Ages, one must understand that nearly every person, peasant, noble, or king, lived in the shadow of the church. Learning and the birth of universities. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine knights, castles, and peasants in the fields. But behind all of that, another quiet revolution was taking place: the growth of education. Knowledge, though limited, was highly prized, and the Middle Ages laid the foundations for the universities we know today. At first, education was almost entirely in the hands of the church. Monasteries kept the flame of learning alive during times when much of Europe was unstable. Monks patiently copied texts by hand, scriptures, histories, even works of ancient Greek and Roman thinkers. Without their effort, much of classical knowledge might have been lost forever. For children, schooling was rare, especially for peasants who were needed on farms. But boys from noble families or those destined for the priesthood sometimes attended cathedral schools, where they learned Latin, reading, writing, and basic theology. Girls, unless they entered convents, usually learned household skills instead. By the 12th century, a new kind of school began to appear in towns. These grew into universities, places where scholars gathered to teach, debate, and study. The first great universities were founded in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. At first, they were little more than groups of students paying masters for lessons, but soon they gained official recognition and became respected institutions. What did students study? The curriculum was based on the 7 liberal arts. The trivium included grammar, rhetoric, and logic. The quadrivium included arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. After mastering these, students could go on to study law, medicine, or theology, which was considered the highest subject of all. University life was far from easy. Students, usually young men, lived in cramped lodgings, often hungry and poor. They copied notes by hand, since books were rare and expensive. Disputes sometimes broke out between students and townsfolk, leading to street fights and riots. Yet despite these hardships, education offered a chance at status and influence. Teachers used a method called scholasticism. This was a way of learning that emphasized logic and debate, often applied to questions of faith and philosophy. Famous thinkers like Thomas Aquinas tried to reconcile reason with religion, blending the wisdom of ancient philosophers with Christian belief. While only a small fraction of people ever attended, universities slowly shaped European thought. They created a network of educated men who could serve as lawyers, doctors, church leaders, and government officials. Over time, this intellectual class helped Europe move from a purely feudal world to one where knowledge itself became a source of power. In short, the Middle Ages were not just about swords and plows. They were also about books, questions, and the search for truth. From monasteries to universities, learning survived and grew, setting the stage for the Renaissance and beyond. Travel and the road to distant lands. Travel in the Middle Ages was nothing like hopping on a train or a plane. Journeys were slow, risky, and uncomfortable. Roads were often muddy, full of ruts, or simply paths across fields. Bandits lurked in forests, and bad weather could turn a short trip into a dangerous ordeal. Yet, despite all these difficulties, people traveled more than we might think. One of the most common reasons for travel was pilgrimage. For the faithful, visiting holy sites was both a duty and a way to seek blessings. Pilgrims walked for miles to shrines like Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or even Rome and Jerusalem. They wore badges or carried symbols to show their status as pilgrims, and along the way, they found inns and hospitals built especially for them. These journeys were often spiritual, but they were also social adventures, bringing together people from many different regions. Trade was another powerful reason to take to the road. Merchants carried cloth, spices, salt, and other goods between towns and across countries. Great trade routes linked northern Europe with the Mediterranean. Italian cities like Venice and Genoa became hubs of commerce, while fairs in places like Champagne in France drew merchants from all over the continent. Caravans of pack animals carried goods across mountains and through dangerous passes, connecting Europe to distant lands in Asia and the Middle East. Knights and soldiers also traveled, sometimes to fight in wars, sometimes to join the Crusades. These long journeys exposed them to new cultures and ideas, though the experiences were often brutal. Adventurers and fortune seekers also set out, hoping to win glory or wealth in faraway lands. Ordinary people rarely traveled far, but sometimes they did. A peasant might leave their village to find work in a nearby town or join a pilgrimage with neighbors. Festivals, fairs, and markets also drew villagers out of their routines, offering rare chances to see the wider world. Travel was so dangerous that many people wrote wills before leaving home. especially if they were going on a long pilgrimage. Bandits, illness, or accidents could easily end a journey. That is why travelers often moved in groups for safety. Yet, despite all the risks, medieval travel had an air of wonder. To walk to a distant city was to see strange foods, new languages, and different ways of life. It reminded people that the world was bigger than their village, and that far beyond their fields lay a network of roads and seas connecting them to countless others. In the end, travel in the Middle Ages was a test of endurance, faith, and luck. For those who dared to set out, the road offered both danger and discovery. Life inside a medieval town. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often picture small villages or lonely castles. But towns and cities were also growing fast, becoming lively centers of trade, craft, and culture. Life inside a medieval town was crowded, noisy, and sometimes dangerous, but it offered opportunities you simply could not find in the countryside. Most towns were protected by walls, gates, and towers. These defenses kept out bandits and rival lords, but they also meant that space inside was limited. Houses were built close together, often leaning toward the street until the rooftops nearly touched. Streets were narrow, muddy, and full of animals like pigs and chickens. There were no proper sewers, so waste often ended up thrown into the street, making towns smelly and unhealthy places. Despite the filth, towns attracted people. Merchants sold goods in busy marketplaces, and craftsmen formed guilds, groups that protected their trades. There were guilds for bakers, shoemakers, weavers, blacksmiths, and many others. To join a guild, a boy usually started as an apprentice, living with a master and learning the craft for years. After becoming a journeyman, he could travel to other towns, practice his trade, and one day present a masterpiece to earn full membership. Markets and fairs were the lifeblood of towns. Farmers brought in food from the countryside, while merchants offered imported goods like silk, spices, and fine cloth. These events were also social gatherings, with music, games, and sometimes performances by traveling entertainers. Towns were also centers of law and order, though justice could be rough. Town councils, often made up of wealthy merchants, made rules about trade and daily life. Night watchmen patrolled the streets, carrying lanterns and staffs, but crime was still common. Fires were another constant danger, since most buildings were made of wood and built close together. Churches and cathedrals dominated the skyline. They were not just religious centers, but also social and economic hubs. Great cathedrals took decades, sometimes centuries, to build and employed countless workers. These massive structures reminded everyone of the power of faith and the wealth of the church. Life in a town was hard, but it offered freedom compared to the countryside. A famous saying went, "Town air makes you free." A runaway serf who managed to live in a town for a year and a day could sometimes gain legal freedom from their lord. Towns, therefore, became places of new beginnings. Of course, not everything was rosy. Overcrowding, disease, and poor sanitation meant that epidemics spread quickly. Yet towns also became centers of energy and innovation. Universities, printing, banking, and new forms of art all grew out of the busy, cramped life inside their walls. Living in a medieval town was noisy, risky, and often smelly. But for many, it was also exciting, a chance to break free from the rigid life of the countryside and be part of something bigger. Medieval medicine and the struggle against sickness. If there was one constant shadow over medieval life, it was sickness. Illness struck rich and poor alike, and without modern science, people had little idea what really caused it. Germs were unknown, microscopes did not exist, and most medicine mixed folk beliefs, religion, and ancient theories. Doctors in the Middle Ages often relied on the ancient Greek idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health meant keeping these in balance. If someone was sick, doctors might bleed them with leeches or cut them to remove blood. They might also prescribe strange mixtures of herbs, minerals, or even ground up animals. Some cures helped a little, but many did more harm than good. Herbal remedies were popular, since plants were easy to find. Monks in monasteries grew herb gardens and wrote books about healing plants. Garlic was used for infections, mint for stomach aches, and willow bark, which contains a chemical like aspirin for pain. Even so, many treatments were based on superstition. A person might wear charms, say special prayers, or carry holy relics to ward off disease. Hospitals existed, but they were not like modern ones. They were often run by the church and focused more on spiritual care than physical cures. Patients might receive food, shelter, and prayers, but not much in the way of effective medical treatment. Surgery was sometimes performed by barber surgeons, men who also cut hair and pulled teeth. Without anesthesia, patients were held down while the surgeon worked quickly, often with knives or saws. The most terrifying disease of the Middle Ages was the plague, especially the Black Death of the 14th century. This epidemic killed millions across Europe, wiping out entire villages. People did not understand how it spread. Some blamed bad air, others thought it was God's punishment. Doctors wore long robes and beaked masks stuffed with herbs, believing this would protect them from the poison in the air. In truth, the plague was carried by fleas on rats, but no one knew this at the time. Families shut themselves indoors, towns built fires to cleanse the air, and processions of flagellants marched through the streets whipping themselves, hoping God would spare them. Nothing worked, and the death toll was overwhelming. Yet not everything in medieval medicine was foolish. Observant doctors noticed patterns, recorded symptoms, and sometimes found treatments that genuinely worked. Midwives helped deliver babies and passed down practical knowledge about childbirth and women's health. Some surgeons became skilled at setting bones or treating wounds, especially in times of war. Still, compared to modern medicine, the medieval world was helpless. A simple infection that today would be cured with antibiotics could easily kill. The sick often relied more on faith, luck, or their own strong bodies than on the medicines of the time. For people in the Middle Ages, illness was part of life. To survive, they mixed faith with trial and error, using every cure they could imagine. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't, but it shows just how much people longed to fight the unseen enemies that haunted their world. Medieval education and the rise of universities. Education in the Middle Ages was not something everyone could access. Most people, especially peasants, lived their lives without ever learning to read or write. Daily survival mattered more than books. But for those who did study, education could open doors to religion, government, and the growing world of scholarship. The church was the main provider of education. Monasteries and cathedral schools taught boys to read Latin, the language of the Bible and official documents. Reading the Bible, copying manuscripts, and learning prayers were at the heart of early education. Writing was done on parchment with quills, and mistakes had to be carefully scraped away with knives. Only a small number of children had the chance to go to school. Girls, for the most part, were taught at home, sometimes learning to read, but more often focusing on skills like weaving, cooking, and managing a household. Noble girls might be taught music, manners, and a little writing, but education was usually seen as a male path. As towns grew, new centers of learning appeared. Universities. The first great universities, Bologna in Italy, Paris in France, and Oxford in England, were founded in the 11th and 12th centuries. These institutions were very different from schools before. They were not just about teaching religion, but also law, medicine, philosophy, and eventually science. Students at a medieval university were often young, sometimes only 14 or 15 years old. They came from many regions, spoke different languages, and lived in crowded lodgings near the school. Life was not easy. Classes could last for hours, with the teacher reading aloud from books while students listened and took notes. Books were rare and expensive, so most knowledge was passed down by memory and lectures. The curriculum focused on the 7 liberal arts. These were divided into 2 groups: the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Once students mastered these, they could go on to study law, medicine, or theology, the highest subject of all. Universities were lively places, but also full of conflict. Students sometimes clashed with townspeople, leading to riots. Drinking, gambling, and mischief were common, despite the serious subjects being studied. Yet at the same time, universities became vital centers of new ideas. They preserved ancient texts, translated works from Greek and Arabic, and trained generations of scholars who would shape Europe's future. One of the most important aspects of medieval education was debate. Scholars loved to argue, testing each other's reasoning with questions and counterarguments. This method, called scholasticism, encouraged careful thinking, even if the answers were often tied closely to church teachings. By the late Middle Ages, education was slowly spreading beyond monasteries and noble courts. Wealthy townspeople began sending their sons to school, and literacy became more valuable in trade and government. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century would soon make books cheaper and learning more widespread. For those lucky enough to study, education was a key to power. It gave access to jobs in the church, in royal courts, and in law. It was a privilege, but also a sign of the changing world. Medieval universities laid the groundwork for the modern idea of learning, showing that knowledge could grow, be shared, and passed on to future generations. Death, faith, and the medieval view of the afterlife. If there was one thing every medieval person had in common, it was the certainty of death. Life was short, fragile, and unpredictable. A fever, a wound, a famine, or the plague could end a life quickly. People were always aware that death could arrive at any moment. This made faith and religion deeply important. The church taught that life on earth was only a preparation for eternity. Heaven was the reward for the faithful, while hell was the punishment for sinners. In between was purgatory, a place of cleansing for souls before they entered heaven. These beliefs shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life. Death was not hidden as it often is today. Funerals were public, graves were dug in the center of towns, and the dead were often buried under church floors. Art and literature constantly reminded people of mortality. Images of skeletons, skulls, and the dance of death were popular, showing that no matter one's rank, death came for kings and peasants alike. When someone died, rituals were important. Priests came to offer last rites, bells were rung, and prayers were said to guide the soul. Families and neighbors gathered, mourning together. Wealthy people might donate money to the church to ensure prayers were said for them after death. Even poor families tried to secure blessings, believing that prayer could shorten time in purgatory. The fear of sudden death, without confession or absolution, was great. People wanted a good death, one that gave them time to prepare their soul. This is why plagues and wars were so terrifying. Not only did they kill, they often gave no chance for spiritual readiness. At the same time, death was not only about fear. It was also seen as a passage, a doorway to something beyond. Festivals like All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day kept memories of the dead alive. People prayed for ancestors, kept relics, and believed the living and the dead were connected in a great chain of faith. This focus on death also shaped medieval culture. Castles, cathedrals, and tombs were built to last for centuries, as a way of reaching for eternity. Literature and art returned again and again to the themes of judgment, salvation, and the meaning of life. For us today, the medieval obsession with death might feel dark or heavy. But for them, it was a source of hope as much as fear. Life was uncertain, but faith offered a path through the unknown. Death was not the end, it was the beginning of forever. And so, as the bells tolled across villages and cities, medieval people lived their lives in the shadow of death, but also in the light of belief that something greater waited beyond.